friends, it's your teen and tween librarian Rebecca, and we're back for another episode of Bedtime Stories. First things first, you probably are noticing that we have a little bit of a different background. I'm not going to lie to you. There is a giant spider in my den right now on the ceiling, and he's too far for me to reach to get him. And he seems like the kind of spider that waits until you're comfortable and you've forgotten about him, and that's when he drops. So to avoid any screaming tonight, I've decided to move to my dining room. So we're gonna have a little change up for the night. So other than that, I'm so excited for our chapter tonight. We're getting really into the action of it. But first things first, summer reading has begun. I hope everybody's signed up for it, but if you haven't yet, you can just go to this website here and get signed up for your whole family. Just remember, kids and teens, you're going to be signing up for the grade that you will be in the fall. So if you're going to be a sixth grader, you're no longer a kid, you're a teen. But otherwise, get started. It's a lot of fun. You can track your minutes and reading and activity from the website. You can keep it on a paper log if you want, or you can download the free Beanstack Tracker app and get signed up that way, and then just track your minutes using your phone or iPad or something. So hopefully everybody gets signed up. We have some fabulous prizes this summer and a lot of fun. So now back to the book. One thing that I love about this chapter is that it's going to show just how much about the current science of the day that Jules Verne was really aware of. I mean, obviously, journeying to the center of the earth, we know now that's not a possibility. And frankly, back then, they didn't think it was a possibility. But this book is why some people say that Jules Verne was the grandfather or the father of science fiction, because he took the science of the day and decided what if and went further. So we're going to learn a little bit how Iceland was formed as we journey on our way to Sneffels. Are you ready? Let's begin with chapter 15. Chapter 15, The Summit of Sneffels. Sneffels is 5,000 feet high. Its double summit forms the limit of a belt of trachyte which stands apart from the contour system of the island. From our starting point, we could not see its two peaks against the grayish background of the sky. All that I could see was a huge skull cap of snow on the giant's brow. We walked in single file, led by the guide, who took narrow paths where two people could not have gone abreast. Conversation, therefore, became more or less impossible. After passing the basaltic wall of the fjord of Stapi, we came first of all to a fibrous peat bog, the remains of the former vegetation of the peninsula's marshes. The vast quantity of this as yet unused fuel would be sufficient to warm the whole population of Iceland for a century. This huge bog, judging by the depth of certain ravines, was often 70 feet deep and revealed successive layers of carbonized remains of vegetation separated by thinner seams of tufaceous pumice. As befitted Professor Liedenbrock's nephew, and in spite of my worries, I could not help observing with interest the mineralogical curiosities displayed in this huge natural history museum, and at the same time I recapitulated in my mind the whole geological history of Iceland. This fascinating island has obviously risen from the depths of the sea at a comparatively recent date. Indeed, perhaps it was still rising imperceptibly. If this was so, its origins could only be attributed to the action of subterranean fires, and in that case, Sir Humphrey Davy's theory, Saknussemm's document, and my uncle's ideas all went up in smoke. This hypothesis led me to make a close examination of the nature of the ground, and I soon became aware of the succession of phenomena which had given it birth. Iceland, which is absolutely devoid of all alluvial soil, is entirely composed of volcanic tufa, that is to say, an agglomeration of porous rocks and stones. Before the existence of the volcanoes, it consisted of trap rocks, slowly raised above sea level by the action of central forces. The internal fires had not yet broken through. Later on, however, a wide chasm formed diagonally across the island from southwest to northeast, through which the trachytic paste gradually emerged. At this stage, the phenomenon took place without any violence. The amount expelled was enormous, and the melted matter thrown up from the bowels of the earth spread out slowly in vast sheets or hillocked masses. This was the period when feldspars, cyanites, and porphyrics appeared. But thanks to this spread, the thickness of the island increased enormously, and consequently its power of resistance. It is easy to imagine what a vast quantity of gases accumulated beneath its surface when, after the cooling of the trachytic crust, it ceased to offer any outlet. A moment, therefore, inevitably came when the explosive force of these gases was such that they raised the heavy crust and provided themselves with openings in the shape of tall chimneys. Hence, the volcano formed by the raising of the crust, and then the crater suddenly pierced at the summit of the volcano. The eruptive phenomena were then followed by the volcanic phenomena. First of all, through the newly formed outlets there escaped the ejected basalt of which the plain we were then crossing offered such wonderful examples. We were walking over those massive, dark gray rocks which the cooling process had molded into hexagonal prisms. In the distance we could see a great number of flattened cones which had once been so many fiery openings. After the basaltic eruption had spent itself, the volcano, its power increased by the extinction of the lesser craters, provided an outlet for the lava, ashes, and cinders whose long screes I could see stretching down the sides of the mountain like flowing tresses. Such was the succession of phenomena which created Iceland. All of them arose from the action of the internal fires, and to suppose that the mass inside did not still exist in a permanent state of liquid incandescence was folly. But the supreme folly was the idea of trying to reach the center of the earth. I consequently felt somewhat reassured by the result of our undertaking as we advanced to the assault of Sneffels. The way was becoming increasingly difficult. The ground was rising. Pieces of rock kept breaking off, and the greatest care was needed to avoid dangerous falls. Hans walked on as calmly as if he were on level ground. Sometimes he disappeared behind the huge blocks, and for a moment was lost from sight. Then a shrill whistle from his lips would tell us which way to go. Often, too, he would stop, pick up a few stones, and arrange them in a recognizable pattern so as to provide landmarks to guide us on our return journey. This was wise precaution in itself, but one which future events were to render useless. 3 hours' tiring march had brought us only to the base of the mountain. There Hans called a halt, and a frugal breakfast was shared out. My uncle ate hurriedly to get on faster, but since this halt was meant for us as well as for food, he had to await the pleasure of the guide, who gave the signal for departure an hour later. The 3 Icelanders, who were just as taciturn as their comrade, the guide, did not say a word and ate very little. We now began scaling the slopes of Sneffels. Its snow-covered summit, by an optical illusion not uncommon in mountainous country, seemed to me to be very close, and yet how many hours it took to reach it! The stones, which were not held together by either earth or grass, kept rolling down to the plain with the speed of an avalanche. At some places, the slopes of the mountain formed an angle of at least 36 degrees with the horizon. It was impossible to climb them, and we had to skirt these stony cliffs, an operation which was anything but easy. At such places, we helped each other with our sticks. I must say that my uncle kept as close to me as he could. He never lost sight of me, and on many an occasion his arm provided me with a firm support. As for himself, he must have had an innate sense of balance, for he never stumbled. The Icelanders, although heavily burdened, climbed with the agility of born mountaineers. Judging by the height of the summit of Sneffels, it seemed to me impossible to reach it from our side, unless the slope became less steep. Fortunately, after an hour of tremendous exertion and difficult feats in the midst of the vast expanse of snow covering the crest of the volcano, a sort of staircase unexpectedly appeared, which greatly simplified our ascent. It was formed by one of those torrents of stone thrown up by the eruptions and called Stina by the Icelanders. If this torrent had not been arrested in its fall by the form of the mountainsides, it would have gone on into the sea and formed new islands. Such as it was, it served us well. The slopes grew steeper still, but these stone steps enabled us to climb them easily, and indeed so rapidly, having stayed behind for a moment while my companions continued their ascent, I saw them already reduced by distance to microscopic dimensions. By 7 in the evening, we had ascended the 2,000 steps of this staircase, and we found ourselves on a sort of bulge in the mountain, a kind of bed on which the actual cone of the crater rested. The sea stretched away 3,200 feet below. We had passed the perpetual snow line, which was not very high in Iceland on account of the constant humidity of the climate. It was bitterly cold, and the wind blew hard. I was exhausted. The professor saw that my legs were failing me, and in spite of his impatience, he decided to stop. He accordingly signaled to the guide, but Hans shook his head and said, "Eventful." "It seems that we have to go higher," said my uncle. Then he asked Hans for his reason. "Mistor," replied the guide. "Ja, mistor," replied one of the Icelanders in a rather frightened voice. "What does that word mean?" I asked anxiously. "Look," said my uncle. I looked down in the direction of the plain. A huge column of powdered pumice stone, sand, and dust was rising into the air, twisting about like a waterspout. The wind was driving it against the side of Sneffels to which we were clinging, and this opaque screen between ourselves and the sun was casting a great shadow over the mountain. If this column were to bend towards us, we should inevitably be caught up in its eddies. This phenomenon, which was not uncommon when the wind blows from the glaciers, is called mistor in Icelandic. "Hastigt, hastigt," cried our guide. Without knowing Danish, I understood we had to follow Hans as fast as we could. The guide started skirting the cone of the crater, but diagonally so to make our ascent easier. Soon the dust storm fell upon the mountain, which trembled at the shock. The stones caught up in the eddies of the wind rained down as in an eruption. Fortunately, we were now on the opposite side and sheltered from any danger. But for our guide's precaution, however, our mangled bodies, pounded to dust, would have fallen a long way off like the remains of some unknown meteor. Yet Hans thought it unwise to spend the night on the side of the cone. We continued our zigzag climb. The 1,500 feet which remained to be covered took us nearly 5 hours. What with all that tacking and countermarching we did, the distance must have been at least 7 miles. I could not stand it any longer. I was weak from cold and hunger, and the rarefied air was not enough for my lungs. At last, at 11 o'clock at night, in complete darkness, we reached the summit of Sneffels, and before taking shelter inside the crater, I had time to see the midnight sun at the lowest point on its course, casting its pale rays on the island sleeping at my feet. And that's the end of chapter 15. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Bedtime Stories. Make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing to the library's YouTube channel. You can also find out what's happening at the library by visiting us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. Or you can always just go to the library's website. I hope to see you again for the next episode of Bedtime Stories, but until then, be well and sleep well.